Hi, Issam.
Hello, Tom.
Hi, good morning. So
Good morning.
I'm here today with my friend Issam Ikirmawi. Issam is a senior producer for Arabic language, he's a senior producer and Arabic language correspondent about Palestinian affairs and general Middle East and international affairs for a major international news network. But Issam's speaking today in a personal capacity, so we won't mention the network. Issam was born in the old city of Jerusalem, near the Damascus Gate in the Muslim Quarter. He grew up there and later in the Jerusalem suburbs. And because Issam speaks English and Hebrew as well as Arabic, he started work as a fixer at a young age and then as a production assistant and a correspondent for many different international broadcasters over 30 years of experience. These include CNN, ABC TV of America, Britain's Channel 4 News, and TV stations in Canada, Japan, Norway, and others in the Middle East, like the Saudi channel NBC, Abu Dhabi TV, and also Al Jazeera. And I know Issam also studied in London, politics and history at SOAS, which is part of London University. And I know that over the years, Issam's met Palestinian leaders like Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas, and he's also met Israeli leaders like Ehud Barak, Ehud Olmert, and Tzipi Livni, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But let's just start at the beginning, shall we, Issam? Just tell us a little bit about your childhood and your family.
Well, as you said in the introduction, I was born in the old city of Jerusalem. My parents were both refugees from the village of Ein Karim, which is now in the suburbs of Jerusalem. And they moved to the old city, while the rest of the family moved to Jordan following the 1948 war. So I was brought up in the old city, and I maintained a link with the old city because we've got a business there. My father had a shop there. So I was sort of like, even when we moved our house out of the old city, we still had this link with the old city whereby the shop is there. So we used to go to the shop every day. So that's where I grew up.
Okay. Which kind of shop is it actually?
When my father started the shop, it was a grocer's shop. And eventually in the early 70s, we turned it into a bookshop selling stationery, guidebooks and postcards and stamps for tourists and that kind of thing, because that was, you know, much more in demand than a grocer's shop.
Yes, I think you mentioned once your brother now runs it. Is that right? Still?
Yeah, that's correct. My brother is now running the shop. Him and his sons. It's still a bookshop, and it's still in the old city of Jerusalem. As you know, a lot of things have changed over the last, I would say, since the first Intifada in 1987. The whole atmosphere in the old city of Jerusalem has changed. Up to then, we used to get, the city was sort of like open to all. We used to get people from all parts of the country, from Israelis used to come to the old city in droves on the Sabbath. So we always had lots of Israelis there. Also people from the West Bank used to come quite a lot to the old city, especially on Fridays for the prayer and during religious festivals like Ramadan and stuff like that. Now, following the Oslo Agreement, when all the restrictions were imposed on the old city, then we started seeing less and less people. Also, Israelis were becoming less and less coming to the old city at that time. I'm talking late 80s, early 90s here. So you can sense that it's not as accessible as it used to be before. And I'm talking about the old city.
Yeah, paradoxically, the peace process has maybe made less peaceful relations on the ground between Israelis and Palestinians. Like you say, there was more interaction in a way before the peace process than there has been since the peace process. Maybe we'll go into the reasons for that a little bit later, but for people who don't know, who don't follow the conflict, it's one of the paradoxes. that both Israelis and Palestinians interacted with each other more, both in the workplace, but also socially, and as you said, even shopping and tourism and this kind of stuff. This happened then after the peace process, the Oslo peace process began in the 90s. In the years since that, there's been less interaction than previously, which is a paradox, or it wasn't the aim of the people behind the peace process, let's say.
Absolutely, that's correct. I mean, I picked up Hebrew from just talking to Israelis, and as you know, Arabic and Hebrew are really similar as languages. So it's not like a huge effort for someone with Arabic as a mother tongue to pick up the Hebrew. It was really quite easy. And yes, you were right. We had Israeli friends. We used to go to, people used to mix freely, much more freely than they do now. I mean, those days, I think, on the whole, people were much more open-minded than they are now.
Yeah. Oh, well, hopefully, you know, that the open-mindedness will come back again sooner than we think. But anyway, and you know English just from studying at school or from TV or tourists, or how?
No, I started learning English when I was about 9 years old at school. And I fell in love with the language, and I just sort of, you know, made more of an effort to learn it properly, watch television, read movies, and I appeared in a couple of movies as an extra when people used to come. I remember one of them was the Rambo movie.
Wow.
They were looking for extras because they were shooting it somewhere near the Dead Sea. So we went there for a couple of days as extras, and I thought, you know, when the movie was shown, I thought, wow, I told all my friends that I'm going to be in this movie. But unfortunately, the scene I was in was cut out.
Ah, cut out. But did you get to see Sylvester Stallone maybe at a distance? No,
we didn't. No, we didn't. We were told, like, we were given some kind of funny costumes. They were told, you know, to sort of stay in the background and just do some gesturing and talk to each other, that kind of stuff. But no, we didn't see Sylvester Stallone, unfortunately.
And so you didn't manage to become a film star, but you did manage to do the second best thing, which is be in front of the TV cameras. Okay, it's not as good as being Hollywood, but the media. And I know from our past discussions, I mean, it's very difficult, I know myself, to get a job in the media. It's very considered a glamorous profession, even if not very well paid, but it's very, you know, a lot of people want to work in the media because it's an interesting job in general. So how did you sort of start off in the media?
Because I spoke English and Hebrew and Arabic, of course. And also because I did a couple of extras roles in some movies. The old city of Jerusalem, I was quite famous in the old city of Jerusalem. People knew who I was because of the shop and because of stuff like that. So one day someone came to me and said, look, there is a foreign crew and they want to shoot a documentary and they're looking for a fixer. Would you be interested? And I said, yeah, sure. And I went and met them. I think they were from Channel 4 or ITN, as it was called at the time.
For anybody, those are British channels for anybody.
Yes,
yeah,
that's correct, British channels. And they were doing something on the refugees. So we went around the refugee camps in the West Bank talking to refugees and stuff like that. And I'm talking about 1979. So that was quite a long time ago.
And so you got a lot of work, and as I mentioned, it's hard to get into the media. On the other hand, there was a lot of interest in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and issue. So in a way, it's easier to get into the media based in Jerusalem than it would have been if you were based in, I don't know, Tibet or Kurdistan or somewhere. But I mean, why do you think there is so much interest in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by international news media?
I mean, at the time, it didn't really make much sense why so many foreign networks were interested in covering stories about the Palestinians and the Israelis. But when I came to Europe, then I realized why there's this like fascination, huge interest. Because as you know, in Europe, Israel is seen as part of the European experience, background, whatever. It's not something like Burma, for instance, or something like Bangladesh. It's very much a European thing because of what happened in the world, because of the Holocaust, because of the history, so there is like this fascination and a huge interest in what's happening there. So, and also, if you look at the region as a whole, because the Middle East and Europe are neighbors, and this relationship has been like up and down over the centuries. It's not just a new thing. I mean, if you go back to the time with the Ottoman Empire, all the wars and the stuff like that. So there's like mutual interest.
Yes, and of course, Jerusalem is one of the most important, famous cities historically in the whole of history. And it's obviously also a meeting point of the three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Islam, Christianity. And it's also, like you say, it's like a fault line in a way between East and West. So it does make sense that there's maybe more interest in what happens there than, I don't know, there are lots of other conflicts, even in the Middle East. Baluchistan, for example, hardly anyone's heard of it. Probably you and I have, but most people probably haven't, or wherever. So what about, I know you late moved to Britain. Before we get to that, are there any other particular little stories or anecdotes on that earlier period in journalism in the 70s and 80s?
I started writing stuff for some print journal, newspapers and stuff like that. Just articles, sometimes about art, sometimes about culture. And, it wasn't like a paid kind of thing. It's just I had this thing about writing. I wanted really to write. I want to tell a story. To me, journalism is really about telling a story. So it's just being a storyteller, to me, is something I really enjoy doing.
Yeah, me too. I mean, of course, we should remind people watching who are not journalists that not everything is bad news and conflict. There's a lot of interesting stories to tell, including Israelis and Palestinians in Jerusalem. Not everything is conflict. There's all kinds of fascinating stories that have nothing to do with violence or disputes. So, as journalists, you don't all the time want to cover bad news. You want to cover also, interesting human stories and cultural stories and so on. I mean, I feel that about myself too. What, you were writing in Arabic, were you, or English for those?
No, I was mainly writing in Arabic for local media, some local newspapers and magazines. So I was just writing articles, and most of them were published at that time. But I wasn't like determined or had a focus on becoming a journalist. It was just something I enjoyed doing, and I didn't mind not getting paid for it. So it was just like a hobby.
Yeah, you kind of fell into the media in a way, and you kind of learned it on the ground. You didn't no journalism school. You just sort of learned on the ground. But then later, I think you were slightly a bit older, you went to study in London at SOAS, which is part of London University. So how was your, I presume that's the first time you lived abroad. How was your impressions of London, or both studying and just London as a whole, or England?
I mean, as you know, in those days, before social media and satellite TV and that kind of thing, when I came over to England, you really feel like cut off. I mean, at the time, I was still writing letters to my mother. Nobody writes letters anymore. So, and international phone calls were quite expensive. So you were lucky to get a phone call every fortnight or something. But it was good in a way, because when you move to from a place, which is a small place at the time, like Jerusalem, to a huge city like London, with all this mosaic of cultures and religions and backgrounds, and so it was like a cultural shock at first to see all these people, and also to come from a place like Jerusalem where everybody knows everybody, and then you come to London and you feel you're just another person. Nobody knows who you are. Nobody cares who you are. So you're just like another individual living in the city. So that was like a shock to me. And it wasn't easy. But what was encouraging at the time, because I came straight to college. So I made some friends at college and got involved in college life, which was really interesting and fascinating at the time. But things have moved a long way. I mean, for instance, when I look at people now, who come from wherever, you know, they stay in touch with their families back home. They watch their local TV stations on the satellite TV. They're on Facebook or Twitter 24/7. So they don't feel like, they feel physically they're being away, but they don't feel mentally and socially they've been away. And I think that in a way, it's got a downside to it, because when these people come over here, they have less of a motivation to learn about, you know, what's happening in Britain or British culture or European culture. So they stay like glued to their own local, you know, culture. So I think that's the downside of it. But and at my time, I had to learn all these things, the little nuances about society, not just the language, about society, about people, how they think, about history, you know, background. All these things were important.
I mean, by the way, I also moved abroad in the 90s from London to Eastern Europe. And of course, it was even more backward in Eastern Europe. It was incredibly difficult making a phone call. Half of the people didn't even have phones. I mean, they weren't landlines, never mind cell phones or mobile phones. And as you say, today, people are constantly in touch through WhatsApp and Facebook and TV and international broadcasters. And although London was international in the 90s, I think people don't realize it's much, much more international today. The last 20 or 30 years has brought a much greater wave of people settling or moving or studying in London from every corner of the earth. And London is really a global city today. And as you say, in the 90s, it was international, but not to the same extent.
Absolutely.
But like you say, there's an advantage having to throw yourself in and learn more about the place than just, you know, living in London without actually interacting with London or with Britain or something. And I know that you ended up marrying someone from England, and then you've divided your time basically since then between, I think it's Ramallah or Jerusalem and London. Let me just ask you though, so you spend a lot of time still in Jerusalem and with Palestinians. What's your view, or rather not your view, but speaking and interviewing Palestinians, both as a correspondent or just friends of yours, with the current state of affairs? You know, nothing's much is happening with the peace process between Palestinians and Israelis. I mean, what's the general view of the stalemate and the Palestinian leadership today?
Well, I can say that in the early 90s, following the signing of the Oslo Agreement and that ceremony in the White House with Clinton and Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, there was a great deal of expectation, and there was a great deal of optimism that, you know, the future is going to be better, things are going to relax, you know, people are going to have a better life. Unfortunately, that did not happen for, you know, both sides. So now, when you go now and you talk to people, there is disappointment, a huge deal of disappointment on both sides, on the Israeli side and also on the Palestinian side, that things have not worked out as they should have been. And there's more tension now. You can feel it in the air. When you go there, people become much more, how to say it, I would not say aggressive, but they're much more gloomy about things. So yes, over the years, you could see the change in people's attitude. I remember when Rabin was assassinated, we went to cover the funeral of Rabin, and there was so much like interaction with people. I mean, lots of Israelis were so excited that King Hussein was coming and Hosni Mubarak was coming, and there was this kind of thing that it was a new era. But unfortunately, after that, then things became more strained, and you could sense that people were really less enthusiastic about the whole thing.
Do you think, in retrospect, or indeed at the time, you know, there was an offer of an independent Palestinian state by Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak, the Israeli Prime Minister, in the year 2000. We're now in November 2020, so it's 20 years later. And it might not have been a perfect offer, but is there disappointment that Yasser Arafat, who was then the Palestinian leader, didn't accept it, or at least didn't accept it as a basis and maybe, make some alterations to it. But, there could have been an independent Palestinian state 20 years ago. And at that time, there was probably more interest in the world in the Palestinian the plight of the Palestinians, and there might have been more money available to invest in that state and so on. Of course, there have been other offers since, including by Ehud Olmert to Abbas and by Donald Trump under the Trump plan now. And those offers, at least the Trump offer, is less than was offered 20 years ago. So do you think there's disappointment that it was, or people think it's maybe a mistake that Yasser Arafat didn't accept that offer?
Well, on the Palestinian side, it has never been revealed what was the offer, to be honest. So all the information we have about what went on in Camp David in the year 2000 comes either from Israeli sources or American sources. As far as the Palestinians and the Arabs are concerned, at the time, reports in the media spoke about that Arafat was pressurized to accept sharing the Al-Aqsa, which is called Haram al-Sharif in Arabic, with the Israelis, and that was something he couldn't refuse, he couldn't accept, because no one would really accept that. But that did not come from an official Palestinian source. It was like based on what Israeli or American narrative. And then after that, we had the second intifada, and the whole thing came to an end, or nothing came out of it. As far as the Palestinians, how they feel about it, talking to people, they feel let down by the Palestinian Authority. They feel the Palestinian Authority did not really do what was supposed to do in terms of creating state institutions, creating facts on the ground. And they also believe that the Palestinian Authority is given so many concessions over the years without getting anything in return. That the most obvious thing, as far as people are concerned, is that you've got now more settlements, you've got more checkpoints, you've got that wall, which is snaking around major cities. So if you ask people now, do you feel you're better off or worse off? Most people say, no, we feel worse off, because, as I said before at the introduction, before Oslo, before the Palestinian Authority, the country was really open. People could, you could go to the Gaza Strip and have lunch and come back, which, most people, they do. Thousands of Gazans used to work in Tel Aviv and Holon and places like that. So people did not feel like they were entrapped in this little open prison.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is. So it is very difficult. On the one hand, as I said, they're disappointed that nothing came out of the peace process, and also they're disappointed with the Palestinian Authority itself.
I mean, it's also maybe a misconception, because the Palestinians are the weaker party to Israel, clearly, militarily, economically, etc. And maybe it was a misjudgment of the Palestinian Authority to turn down offers, thinking something better will come. And look, if you look at it today, Donald Trump, earlier this year, 2020, unveiled the Trump plan. I think it's pretty clear that it's, let's say, tilted towards Israel. Nevertheless, there is an offer of a Palestinian state there. I don't think anyone would expect the Palestinian Authority to accept the Trump plan as outlined. But do people nevertheless think it might be a mistake not to at least talk to the Americans and the Israelis and say, look, we want the following 50 or the following 200 changes to this plan, but here's what we want changed, but not talking at all as the Palestinian Authority have done, as Mahmoud Abbas has done, doesn't seem to me to advance Palestinian interests, because meantime, as we see, other Arab countries, including recently Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates and Sudan, and if we are to believe Donald Trump, another 5 or 10 Arab countries are lined up, are deciding to make separate agreements with Israel. So, but I'm asking you what your impression from interviewing and speaking Palestinians is, whether they think, look, doing nothing is not serving the interests of us on the ground, ordinary Palestinians.
Well, so as far as Palestinians are concerned, and this is sometimes it's very difficult to gauge when talking to Israeli and Western journalists. As for Palestinians, they think the two-state solution on the 1967 border is a huge compromise on their part, because for Palestinians, Palestine, the whole of Palestine, is the homeland. So once you've taken like 72 or 73% out of that, which became Israel in 1948, so the Palestinians, when do you talk to them about compromise and concessions and whatever, they think, yeah, but we have already compromised on 73% of our homeland. So we can't compromise on the further 27% or whatever. So this is, I think this is the main dichotomy here, that while Israelis and some of the American administrations believe that there should be compromise on both sides, the Palestinians believe that they have already paid their dues. So when they're asked to do more compromise, they think this is unfair because we have already paid our dues.
Yeah, I mean, of course, many Israelis have a different narrative, a different historical, beliefs in whose land and territory and so on. But leaving that aside, the reality is that life often is not fair. So, and people don't get what they want, and there are, as far as I'm aware, at least 100, some say 130 other peoples in the world who would like an independent state. Some of them are quite well known, like in Tibet or Chechnya or Kurdistan or Catalonia, or even ones closer to home like Scotland, Northern Ireland, whatever. There are many, many countries around the world that want independent states or different borders, and there are many, many borders that changed in history. And we see fragmentation of other countries like Syria, for example, all kinds of different groups there. Or in Lebanon, there are many different groups and so on. So it's not necessarily what's about fair or so on. I personally am a realist. If I was a Palestinian nationalist, I would do a little bit what the Israeli nationalists did, what Ben-Gurion did in 1948, and take what territory I can and build upwards from there. And I'd also do what actually Israel did before Israeli independence, which is build up the institutions of statehood. So, for example, last year I was in Iraqi Kurdistan. They haven't gained independence, but were they to be independent, I think it could probably work functionally as a state, because the Iraqi Kurds have built up, independent economic interests and businesses and rule of law and all kinds of stuff. So as far as I can see, it's obviously difficult for the Palestinian Authority because you still have Israeli soldiers in various checkpoints and in various places in the West Bank and in Gaza. You have border restrictions around Gaza by Israel and Egypt. But nevertheless, I'm also worried that if and when Palestinians have independence, I want it to be a successful state. I don't want it to be a kind of failed or semi-failed state. And I'm worried that the Palestinian Authority has not built up internal structures for a state, so that if and when they're a state, it will work. It will be a successful state. I don't know what you think of that, or people who speak to.
Well, Salam Fayyad, when he was prime minister, he tried to build state institutions. Unfortunately, it didn't work out for him, for all sorts of reasons, internal and external. We have to bear in mind, since the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, there have been one general elections. Since then, there have been no general elections. Mahmoud Abbas' term had ended in 2009. the Palestinians have not really had the chance to say what they want. There have been no people like running with a manifesto to tell people what they want. So they haven't really had the chance to choose what they want. It's been really an uphill struggle as far as they're concerned. As I said, the Palestinian Authority, the general feeling is that the Palestinian Authority was waiting or was relying on the goodwill of others. For instance, when President Bush spoke about the roadmap, so a lot of people were sort of thinking that that will deliver the Palestinian state. That did not happen. Then, you know, it's just been from one disappointment to the other.
Yeah.
And on the ground, a lot of things have changed on the ground. Like we said earlier, now you've got more settlements, you've got more checkpoints, you've got more walls, you've got more restrictions, and you've got this divide now between the West Bank and Gaza for whatever reason. You know, that's something also weighing heavily on people. So it's just the impression you get by talking to people there that the whole thing has been a fiasco. That, you know, people can point to all sorts of things and you know, blame all sorts of people. But the thing is, what people were aspiring to prior the Oslo Agreement has not materialized. And this is what you get. Even yesterday, I was reading in some of the local papers saying that, yes, you know, the Trump plan was rejected. But where is the alternative? What is the strategy? It's not good enough just to say, I don't accept this. You have to come up with an alternative, and that's lacking. So there is a great deal of like soul searching going on at the moment in the Palestinian territories. And a lot of questions are being asked. As far as the Arab countries, some Arab countries normalizing relations with Israel, if you read the Arab press as a whole, you see that the general consensus that it's been done with very heavy American pressure. It's not, I mean, there was a poll, I think, recently, a survey in Arab countries, and something like 90% of people said that they oppose having normalized relations with Israel before a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is found. So it's very much seen as something done by the regimes in these countries, not by the people of these countries.
So, Issam, we're almost out of time, but I mentioned that you've met as a journalist in the past Yasser Arafat and later Abbas, Mahmoud Abbas. Just for anyone who doesn't know, there've only been two leaders of the PLO and then Palestinian Authority, Arafat and then Abbas until today, and Abbas is quite old at this point. He's in his mid-80s. And you've also met very senior Israeli leaders, Ehud Barak, who was the prime minister, Ehud Olmert, who was the prime minister later, and others like the foreign minister, Tzipi Livni. So
and the late Shimon Peres.
Shimon Peres. I don't want to lump all these people together because they're all different people. Tell us a little, how did you meet Arafat and later Abbas? What were your impressions?
Arafat was a chance meeting. We were filming Gaza a few weeks after he returned from Tunisia or wherever he was. And we were filming in Gaza. By chance, we drove past his HQ. And it was Eid, the first day of Eid, so there were lots of people coming to greet him. So we just got out of the car and went and shook hands with him and ended up doing a small interview with him, on, you know, without planning, without anything. My impression that, you know, Arafat is a very clever man and he's very savvy with the media, and he's got lots of charisma. So you're drawn to him. When you see him surrounded by people, you are drawn to him. As a person. I also saw him here in London when he came to London. Many people, Arafat is such a divisive figure. As far as the Palestinians are concerned, there are those who adore him and think he was a great leader, and there are those who think he was a complete failure for all sorts of reasons. So public opinion is divided about Arafat. As far as Abbas is concerned, Abbas has never really been like a popular leader. He's seen more like a businessman or a bureaucrat. but not like a leader. He hasn't got like grassroots support in the Palestinian territories. He's seen someone who succeeded Arafat and the head of the Palestinian Authority, but nothing more really you can say about him.
I mean,
as far as
often charismatic leaders deliberately choose somewhat non-entities as their deputies because they don't want to be overshadowed. That's happened in many, often the vice presidents candidates in America, they deliberately choose people who are like haven't got that much charisma, although maybe Kamala Harris is an exception, but you know, and in other countries too, they don't want to be overshadowed. Nevertheless, Abbas has managed to stay in power for almost 16 years now or something. So anyway, sorry to interrupt. What about the Israeli leaders?
Well, the Israeli leaders, my first Israeli leader I met was Shimon Peres, and I met him in Haifa. There was a seminar or conference on peace, and I think that was 1998. He's very charming, very friendly. I think he's a deep thinking man. I think even in Israel, Israelis did not really get Shimon Peres very much. I think he was more of a diplomat rather than a politician.
Or even, I have also met him a few times. He was almost a philosopher in a way.
Yes.
He wasn't, that's actually why he probably had, people admired him more in the rest of the world. I don't think Israelis ever particularly warmed up to Shimon Peres because he wasn't in the rough and tumble of Israeli politics. He was almost too, he could have been a philosopher or something. But sorry, go on.
Yes, he was very much like that. He talked, I remember we had a very long discussion with him. I was with some of my colleagues there, and we had a very long discussion with him. And he was talking about his vision for the future and, you know, how things could work out and, you know, how people could benefit from their interaction and cooperation and stuff like that. So he was really talking more like someone who's looking, you know, forward, years ahead. Visionary. I would say visionary. Barak, no, Barak is with Barak you feel like he's streetwise, you know. It's because I remember when he saw me, he recognized me. He said, he looked at me and said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "From Jerusalem." And he came over to me. He's much shorter than me. And put his arm around me. And he said, "Look, we need to have a talk." And I said,
that was in London. You met him, didn't you, at 10 Downing?
Yeah, outside number 10, yeah. And he said, "We need, listen, next time I'm in town, we need to sit down and have a proper talk. Unfortunately, I've got to rush to the airport now." I said, "Yeah, that would be great." So, and he spoke to me in Arabic, and I didn't know until then that actually he spoke Arabic, but he did, with Egyptian accent. Mm-hmm. Yes. Olmert also, I met him here when he was deputy prime minister. He was visiting number 10, and there was a press conference with him and Jack Straw at the time. He was foreign secretary here in the UK. Yeah, a politician. Olmert, I would say, is just a politician. You know, Tzipi Livni, I met her in Jerusalem. She was there was an anti-BDS conference in Jerusalem. And we went to cover that, and we met her there, and she talked about why she was there and, you know, her position on the BDS movement. So yes, it's been interesting.
So anyway, Issam, we're out of time, unfortunately. I know for anyone watching that Issam, of course, also covers other issues, European affairs, international affairs, wider Middle Eastern affairs, not just Israeli-Palestinian affairs. So sorry we didn't have time to go to the rest of the world. Any parting thoughts before we have to sign off?
Thank you very much for this chat. It brings back some nice memories.
Yes.
So yes, it's been great. Thank you very much, Tom. And hopefully we'll chat again soon.
Yes, hopefully once this coronavirus period is over, it'll be easier to meet. Okay,
absolutely.
Take care. All right, bye.
You too. Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye.